Good afternoon and welcome to our town hall. My name is Sheila Hesh and I'm the Executive Director of Sales at the MGM National Harbor, and I'm Chair of the HSMAI DC Chapter Advisory Board. Today we're continuing our mission of HSMAI, which is to fuel sales, inspire marketing, and optimize revenue. And since we're not able to meet in person, we're continuing our educational efforts virtually. This is the 9th webinar in our pandemic series, and we're so thankful that you've joined us. Today, we're happy to present our very first virtual town hall. The goal of the event is to arm you with information to help jumpstart your budget process and to give you a glimpse into the critical information that will be shared in next month's highly anticipated State of the Industry event. Our speakers are Bob Gilbert, President and CEO of HSMAI, and John Hack, Senior Industry Analyst at TravelClick. But before we get started, let me tell you a little bit about each of them. As President and CEO of HSMAI, Bob has guided the organization through a dynamic period of change as the 7,000 plus member organization has been reestablished globally to grow the revenue for hotels through sales, marketing, and revenue optimization. During Bob's tenure, HSMAI has received tremendous success with initiatives ranging from development of expert communities in areas of digital marketing, resort marketing, and revenue management, as well as the development of HSMAI University webinars and certification programs. He was also instrumental in the global expansion through the formation of HSMAI Global, as well as regional development in Europe, Asia Pacific, and the Middle East. And as a fun fact, Bob has been a member of HSMAI since joining the student chapter at his alma mater, Cornell. As Senior Industry Analyst at TravelClick, John Hack has over 38 years of e-commerce marketing experience in the travel industry. He's a regular industry speaker whose insights and perspective have been featured on CNN, CNBC, Bloomberg, and the New York Times. John is a graduate of Chicago State University and has served as a guest lecturer and advisor at Roosevelt University in Chicago, Boston University, and at Cornell's University School of Hotel Administration. John was chairman of the Florida Commission on Tourism and executive director of the California Tourism Industry Association. And for those listening in, if you have any questions for our speakers, please enter them into the question box and we'll be sure they get addressed. Also, please note that you will receive a link to today's recording. And with that, gentlemen, take it away.
Thank you, Sheila. It's so nice to have everybody with us today as a preview to what we're going to do in another month at the State of the Industry address. Now that Sheila's been through those bios, everybody knows how old John and I really are, but I think it goes without saying that we're looking at a time in the hotel industry where I don't think any of us are looking forward to budgeting for 2021 because there's a lot of information we just don't know yet. But it is, this first slide I've got for you simply illustrates what's happened. If you look at the RevPAR in the U.S. alone, certainly these patterns and trends had ripple effects around the globe, but the crisis that we're currently in continues to change by the day, but the statistics are the same. The hotel industry in the history of the industry has never seen a drop like it has right now. Unfortunately, we've got John to give us some specific numbers about what we're seeing in the DC market, but just know that everybody is really struggling. According to this forecast from CBRE, I mean, they have estimated the number of quarters before they think we will get back to the same level of business the hotel was at prior to this pandemic. And they've also compared it to some of the other downturns that we've seen in the industry, which are the green and the yellow lines of other recessions we've had. Clearly, there's never been anything quite as deep as this. And they have in here currently a V-shaped recovery, but I think it's going to be different in different markets and for different hotel types. The next thing that has been updated by CRBE is their industry forecast. And these both from STR and from CBRE have been both updated at least twice since the beginning of the pandemic. Numbers being what they aren't pretty, but the forecasted occupancy for this year now is annualized to be somewhere in the low 40% range. And if you're really focused on year-over-year increases, certainly 2021 will look good relative to 2020, but they don't expect the industry to reach even the similar occupancy levels of 2019 until 2022. And so the supply and demand changes are over there as well. What's interesting is in 2021, they're actually forecasting a decline in supply, which is very, very rare in this industry. So bottom line is this is unprecedented time. And I know that word has been used a lot, but clearly that's the world we're living in. So you may be wondering, so what has HSMAI been doing? Well, certainly I want to just tee up a couple of things that I want to make sure you're taking advantage of, because we've put together a lot of free resources or low-cost resources for members and stakeholders. There's a resource center we've developed. The Insights newsletter has been chock full of content. The HSMAI universities put a lot of our programs on sale, and there's toolkits available for best practices. So there's a lot of stuff we've done. And the next thing I'd like to just mention is that if you happen to be part of ASAE's virtual convention last week, you may know this, but we're really excited that ASAE recognized HSMAI as one of the top 100 associations in the industry based on our response to the pandemic. So if there's resources we've developed that you've not been able to dive into, definitely take advantage of those, and they can help you navigate your own path to recovery. Just a couple quick headlines on the different things we've developed. Do take time to go into the resource center. That you can find 3 different downstreams there. That's easy to find a lot of stuff that we've developed in terms of our insights. The section of our site right now that's getting the most click-throughs is the customer insights. We've actually aggregated all the sentiment surveys we've found from all different types of market segments, whether it's leisure travel, meetings and conventions, meeting planners, sentiment surveys, or corporate travel. We've aggregated them all, and we're updating those every week with new surveys as they come out. The next thing that I want to make sure you're aware of and can take advantage of is the insights. The customer content insights that I mentioned, we are publishing every Friday in the insights newsletter that goes to every member. Normally there's 9 pieces of content we push out every week, 3 in sales, 3 in marketing, 3 in revenue, but we've added a whole new section here for customer insights now that has, we've got about 6 or 7 different business intelligence providers that are feeding us their surveys. So this is really one-stop shopping for you. The third thing that we're doing, you should be taking advantage of, is a lot of our online learning programs. We now have a total of 4 essentials classes, 1 in sales, 1 in digital marketing, 1 in hotel analytics, and 1 in revenue management. And each of these classes are a 6-week class with 1 hour a week with a live instructor, some short micro learning in between. And it's a great way to really reskill or upskill yourselves or any of your teams. One of the trends we're already seeing is where there's been a number of furloughed or laid off employees, the associates that are remaining at hotels are doing more functions. And so the need for them to reskill or upskill or learn about other disciplines has really never been higher. Our certification programs have also lowered the prices on those. Our study guides, our publications have been available for free for members, so we encourage you to take advantage of all that type of stuff. And the last thing I want to mention is really what we just announced last week. The HSMAI Road to Recovery 2020 is basically the largest compilation we have ever produced of online learning programs. We have over 5 different types of experiences available for 35 different virtual events between now and the end of the year. Many of them are free or low cost, so we really encourage you and your teams to take advantage of them. It's one thing that's really new and different that we've never done before is a soft skills class that we partnered with Mindset Digital on. This is a 3-week program that starts in September. It's free to all members, and it really is all about how do you, as a sales, marketing, or revenue person, deal in the small screen environment. How do you write for impact? How do you position yourself on the small screen? How do you design presentations more effectively for impact, all in a small screen world, which is certainly the life that we're all living in. Also in September, there'll be a webinar with a global economist, and then there's going to be a series of other programs we'll be doing that's all part of the Road to Recovery. So watch your email for those information, for more details on those, and we encourage you to do that. And the last thing you should know, if you're an HSMAI member, we did extend the grace period for membership for a lot of our members, and we've also been recognizing hospitality heroes that are some of those people that have really gone above and beyond what is normally done during this pandemic. So if you've got somebody in your team that should be nominated for a hospitality hero, by all means, those are open, and we'll be recognizing those individuals at least to the end of the year. So that's really what HSMAI is doing. I just want to give you a quick update on that. And since this is a town hall format, we'll pause for just a minute and see if there's any questions about the two data slides I showed or anything about HSMAI. You can use the questions box over on the right-hand side of your screen, and we'll be monitoring that for the rest of the presentation. So I don't see anything there yet, so we're going to keep on moving then. All right. So what's next? Well, it's my pleasure to introduce John Hack, a longtime friend. As was mentioned, we've both been in the industry a long time. John, I don't know how do you articulate what's next, but would you agree that in our history in the industry, we've ever seen anything quite like this before?
Well, again, it's a pleasure and a privilege to be here, Bob and team. And, you're totally right. You hate to use that word unprecedented. My mom's 94. She's in a nursing home. I've been able to see her maybe once or twice. And I asked her to ask Alexa, other than unprecedented, what can you come up with? And she said, unimaginable and just inconceivable. And I think all of those words help describe this industry. You had said a couple of things that I want to reinforce. And again, it's a pleasure and a privilege to be working with you. I want to thank Sheila, Kathy, you, Bob, and of course, Ellen. This doesn't happen without Ellen. I also want to thank Chris Zendesh from our team, who's just a tremendous local resource for hoteliers in the Washington, D.C. area. I remember in early March, I just got back from San Francisco where I did an HSMAI function, and I came to a graduate hotel conference in Nashville. And it was one of those mornings where I think everyone was starting to think about the reality of COVID. And, many of us that have been in the industry for a long time look at a lot of resources. I think, you had said something, Bob, about micro learnings. And I think that keeps us all fresh and active today because we're always learning new things in small increments of time. And I remember that early March morning in Nashville, I went to the IATA site, the International Air Transport Association. And people were asking me at that time two things. And I think, Bob, you and I are always asked this: how bad is it going to get? And how long is it going to last? And on that IATA site, on that morning, I remember IATA saying for the first time, this was going to be worse than 9/11. And in about 20 minutes after reading that, I went to a room of about 300 people, and I quoted IATA, and the room was completely silent. And I was happy that I wasn't saying that as John Hack. Actually, I was looking at a very credible organization. And Bob, as you said, if you're looking at IATA, if you're looking at STR, CBRE, everyone is out there. And the good news, I guess, is that we're off those April lows. I'll show that numerically. And then we're saying, how long is it going to last? And I think, the opportunity today to come to the town hall and speak candidly to this group is fantastic. I'm excited about going back and having a virtual state of the industry with you and the team in about a month, because I think then we'll actually have even more data and can come up with this question of how do we budget for 2021? I think all of us are putting, our heads around that. And so, Bob, it is something that, has never happened before. I think that where we look at this is we look at the forward-looking data. I think most of you that are familiar with us know that we have a product called Demand 360, which is real data from real hoteliers in near real time. And it's forward-looking hotel information right from the reservation systems, does not have any personally identifiable information. So we kind of let the numbers speak for themselves. And I put together today with Chris's help, a presentation that will speak to the numbers. I've also included some other external sources because we can always learn from other sources. And as we transition, I just quickly, Ellen, if we could go to the next couple of slides, I want to talk about the agenda and putting this together with you and the team. We wanted to look at the context of obviously Washington, D.C., where we'll focus the majority of our time today, but also look at this globally and from a North American perspective, because one of the things that we're seeing, which I really do think helps us budget for 2021, is that this virus is the same in Wuhan as it is in Westchester. It didn't discriminate it. It's ubiquitous and it has similarities. I think as hoteliers, we look at the advanced reservation window and we're always gauging when that guest is going to come. When should we market to that guest? And there's similarities when we start to look at the recovery in China, in South Korea, even in places like Italy that I think have directional guidance. So I'll speak to those, Ellen. So let's go to the next slide and we'll start to look at this. This information's from OAG. It's actually updated weekly on the OAG site. And it shows something that I think is very, very predictable in terms of looking at how bad it got and where it's at today. And again, because this isn't like some of the SARS or some of the other not pandemics, but viruses that kind of had regional impact. This is a global pandemic. So you can see that low that hit globally in April. Now, what's noteworthy, and Ellen, we can go to the next slide. The United States was a little late to the game here, because when we started to look at the impact on occupancy, the impact on air travel, we started to see that the United States really started to hit a low point, if you will, about 60 days after China. And I think that's an important milestone for the audience today, is to think about that latent impact of when China had its worst portion of the impact and how it's coming today. And I'll share some of that additional insight when we meet again in September. But the point is, right now, when you look at the lows, we're off the lows, but we have a long, long way to go to get any part of stability in the data. And I think we all realize until there's a vaccine, until there's a treatment drug that can help people, quickly or relatively quickly recover, we're going to be in this prolonged state. But the state that we're in, and I want to stress this point because I think it's a very important takeaway for our participants today, is that over the last 8 to 12 weeks, we've seen a stability in the numbers. Even though when you look at the news, the mainstream news, and you think about some of the states that have been hard hit with this, and you go into Texas, California, Arizona, and Florida, people still traveled even though the infection rates were high. And I'm going to point those out in some of the slides today, which means that when we start to think about this as hoteliers, there is an addressable audience that's traveling today. A lot of it's coming by car within 300 miles, and that audience is increasing week over week, and I'll show that. So Ellen, let's move on, because we've got some other information here that I think is really important. And this is what I like about this slide is it's available in the public domain. It's updated Monday through Friday, and it shows directionally at a level for the United States where we're going through and the progress we're making. And for those of you, I think this, again, I want to make sure that this is educational in a context. So this is actually the TSA numbers of people that pass through checkpoints in the United States. Now, I think what's very important to look at this, and one of the reasons I look at this daily, is that we may think about flying, but for different reasons we say, well, maybe it's not safe to fly. Maybe the airline's going to change schedules. What's nice about this information are these are people that have flown, and you can see that the numbers are updated, and we've got the information here through the 17th. I looked this morning for yesterday's information, and it's directionally accurate with this, which means that if you look at a 3-day, week over week moving average, and again, what we're starting to see now in terms of trends is not looking at prior year, not looking at last month, but looking at week over week increments and find out whether that market has any incrementality, or if that market actually is stagnant, or unfortunately, if it's moving behind, if it's trailing, if it's declining. But we're seeing stability. And again, I'm looking at these numbers. They're updated Monday through Friday. And what's nice about this data set is if you compare it the 8th to the 15th, the 9th to the 16th, or the 10th to the 17th, you see that there's stability, there's predictability. For those of you that have listened to our presentations before, especially over the last 3 to 4 years, I think one of the things we looked at is that the industry was moving in very small increments. A 1%, a 2% increase in occupancy in 2018, 2019, those were big numbers. And so when you start to see stability in data, when you start to see predictability in numbers, you help answer that first question, which how bad is it going to get? And Bob, you and I can talk about this after I finish the next couple of slides. But the perspective here is that hopefully. But what the numbers are saying, more than hope, we have to look at data, and really, frankly, we have to fight fear with facts. And the data, today's data, next week's data, I think is the best medicine we have right now to offer some hope, but some really logic and predictability. So again, the TSA numbers, I think, is again merging best practice. So wanted to share that with the audience today. I'll have much more on this during the State of the Industry next month. Ellen, if we can move on to the next slide, please. So, past, present, future. This is a very interesting kind of mosaic because when you start to look at this in terms of, North America, Canada, the United States, and of course, China, you can see this road to recovery actually began in May. So looking at it from a series of, is it stable? Yes. Is it going to get worse? Probably not. Where are we headed? We don't know, but we have to use data to help us guide this. Now, the cautionary note in this that I think is, again, a footnote, and we're going to footnote some of these slides. We know many of you ask for the presentation, and as an added value, you're going to see that there's going to be footers that are going to be placed on some of these slides, which will help explain to your colleagues that weren't able to attend today, but may have interest in this information. We're trying to make this pass around value of the presentation with our partnership with HSMAI be more impactful for you. So you'll see those appear. I'll speak to those as we go through the slides. But the point here is this. Going into the 4th of July holiday, especially in the United States, we knew we were going to have a slight travel peak and opportunity. Now, when you put this in context, again, another important footnote here, and Bob, you and I can talk about this because I think we might have some time to talk, and I'd like to get your perspective on this too. No one's saying that group is going to come back anytime soon. As reasonably optimistic as we can be about the transient recovery, as hoteliers, as industry colleagues, we need to be very mindful of what we're going to do to replace that group business. Now, there's some anecdotal evidence out there within the last, I'd say, 1 to 2 weeks that there's small groups that are coming back. But, and we should look at those groups as opportunities. But the point here is we see this uptick, which is a nice little uptick to look at in slides. We're seeing one, and again, a heads up for those of you that really are thinking about being opportunistic. I know this is a fearful time to put out marketing budgets, but over the last 7 to 10 days, we're seeing a very similar uptick for people that want to get on that one last summer vacation before virtual school or semi-virtual school starts. But we're seeing an uptick in real time, and we'll talk about how to get that audience. But the problem here, and this is a problem, is when September starts and summer begins to end and the group business doesn't come back, what are you doing? How are you going to outmarket the competition? And I think that's the question, and we want to help you answer not only today, but again in September, because in September, summer's going to be, really, really behind us. So again, a reasonably optimistic slide, but this is behind us. So let's start to talk about what's in front of us. So Ellen, could we go to the next slide, please? Okay. Now, a couple of really, really important pieces of information here. And again, people will ask us, well, I only want to look at Washington because that's my only market. We're going to get to Washington. I promise you we'll get to Washington. But when we start to look at data overlays on what's happening internationally in the United States, there's a lot of similarity here. And when you start to think about it from a context of, I want to take my family on vacation. I'm not going to be, I'm working virtually. I have the opportunity to go to Washington, D.C., and maybe I can even work a couple days in Washington and then take my family to the monuments, to the museums. Am I going to go to Washington? Or am I going to go to San Antonio? Those are the questions people are asking. And there's a couple of key points here. When you start to look at where we are in terms of property, so we give you the data set here, and we look at the current summary. And again, what we're looking is, we're looking all the way into October. Now, what we're seeing is that there is recovery. The recovery is coming mostly in the transient space, which is more predictable, and it's coming in shorter increments of time. But here's the key point, and Ellen, if we could go to the next slide, please. When we start to look at where people are choosing to stay. Now, this slide is a little different. Again, we're looking at other industry sources that can help you give you a credible view. Many of you are aware of the competition of Airbnb, VRBO, alternative accommodations. This data comes from our alternative accommodation data partner, Transparent. It's publicly available on their site. What we're seeing in the data, now this may change in September, and another reason that we want to revisit it during the State of the Industry, But right now, when you look at this globally, when you look at this in North America, for every one transient reservation hoteliers are getting in North America, there's about 2 transient opportunities in alternative accommodations. As bad as this pandemic has been, Airbnb is filing to go public. They're going to have more money to compete. Now, why is this happening? Many of you are probably in this group of, I think that Bob Gilbert's rental home, Bob, I don't know if you have a rental home, but if you do, maybe more safe than a hotel, okay? That's the sentiment. There's Bob's updating the sites with his team, getting a lot of information. We're actually polling the phone reservations that we manage as a service business of customers' biggest concerns. The health and safety protocols are foremost in everyone's mind when it comes to making a hotel reservation.
Could you try?
That was Siri. I apologize. Siri's talking to me. I try to shut her off. But the health and safety protocols are really first and foremost in everyone's minds right now. And how we compete on those standards is one of the opportunities. It's one of the attributes to get that transient audience. I could speak about this all day because it's such an important imperative. People will ask us, how do we get this audience? Well, make sure that your COVID standards, your cleanliness standards, are you touchless? Do you have adjoining room promotions for family members? You're competing against maybe a party size of 3 or 4 because it's a transient. Do you have a buy one, get one free for adjoining rooms? How many adjoining rooms do you have? How can you market to a local competition that mathematically right now is bringing in 2 guests for every 1 that's brought into the hotel business? I mean, we got to face facts with facts. This is a terrible pandemic. We use the words of unimaginable, unprecedented, but at the end of the day, think about this. Airbnb is going public. So we have to have messages, we have to have standards to address this. And I felt that it was more or less my duty today to just share this with you because it's an opportunity for a guest that we may not see in the hotel numbers, but when we start to look at alternative accommodation, that multiplier effect is there for a larger party size. So definitely wanted to share that with you. Ellen, can we go to the next slide, please? So this is the other piece. This is just, I look at this all over, and this is the United States. We'll show Washington, D.C. But when you start to think about guests making decision in real time, this booking window compression, the shortened time from when people decide to make a trip and actually go, it's quantitatively greater now than it's ever been. People are deciding and pulling the trigger to go within 7 days. When you think about your cancellation policies of allowing reservations in those current weeks and mining data to get that guest inside 7 days, a great opportunity for hoteliers because people are traveling. You see it in the TSA numbers. We see it in the Airbnb numbers. But how do we get those guests? Your policy inside 7 days. And let me also say this. We learned a lot back in 2001 and 2008 about not just lowering rates. We called it the sprint to the bottom mentality and how bad it was for the hotel industry. If you think about that reservation window inside 7 days now, please don't panic and start lowering rates for outside 7 days. Compete with value. I know it's easier said than done. It's easier said than done. But if we can hold rate, especially outside 14 days, and there is some type of good stimulus in terms of economic stimulus or even hope for the vaccine, we won't have that much farther to go back for ADR recovery. When we went through this back in 2008, and remember, it wasn't as bad then, it took us at least 4 years to get ADR back. Now, the data is showing us that reservation window, that decision window is inside 7 days. So I would say the data is let's compete inside that week and maybe into 10 to 14 days. But to start lowering rates for 21 day plus business right now, we can hold ADR and get the audience that's there. I think that would be wise to make sure that we're holding rate and learning from what happened in the past that we want to avoid happening again. So
hey, John, can I jump in for a second with a quick question? I mean, Please. It was interesting you mentioned that because Well, I think one of the best quotes from STR's Hotel Data Conference last week was that we have a demand problem, we don't have a pricing problem. And I think so many people forget that because we don't have a pricing problem in the customer's eyes. What we have is just a demand issue. So that certainly reiterates that point. But John, a question on the compression, because I think these numbers are really fascinating. I think there was a report out last week in Europe, the average lead time is like down to a day for some markets. Are you seeing any difference across market segments? Is that primarily leisure, corporate? What type of traveler, or is it all travelers that represent this compression you're seeing?
Yeah, no, excellent question. Thanks, Bob. Couple of things. We're learning from what's happening in Europe, especially with, again, we've got a lot of new names in the industry right now. So most of us are familiar with travel bubbles and the reciprocal travel arrangements that have happened really between the UK, Spain, and Italy and France. And what we see is people do not want to quarantine for 10 or 14 days. So when there's a quarantine measure that is even rumored about, there's a surge in airfare prices, people are coming home, people are not traveling. People are not traveling because they want to stay away from that. Now in New York this week, there is probably some of it's Washington, D.C., but in New York, the guests have to register and say where they're coming from, right? And so when your local municipality or government puts in a travel restriction, it really takes away a lot of the transient demand, which, to answer that question, Bob, has mostly at this time been transient leisure. I'll speak a little bit about, and I've got a slide about the GDS recovery and talk about that. But to date, it's been now some of that is seasonal because of the summer, but the piece here, and again, it speaks to this compressed reservation window, is people are thinking about going, but they're really deciding or pulling the trigger inside 7 days. And it's mostly a transient leisure guest at this time, which again, kind of tees up the conversation, Bob, I know you and I want to have in September was, what about that corporate? What about the rate segmentation specifically to Washington, D.C.? Is government business coming back within the next 45 to 90 days? And we'll share that data again in September. But Bob, to answer that question, it's mostly transient leisure and it's inside 7 days. And when there are no travel restrictions, and even, great example, and I didn't have time to put this in, but if you look at California, Arizona, Florida, and Texas, and they've subsided a little bit in terms of COVID activity, they still, in the midst of that increase, had week over week increases in transient occupancy, mostly from the drive market. And if I didn't have the numbers, I could never say that to this group, but mostly from the drive market. So the audience is there. And I think the key takeaway is, how are we competing with alternative accommodations to make the value proposition to the guests? So thanks for the question, Bob. Were there any more? I'll continue then.
Go ahead.
Okay, can we go to the next slide, please? Then there's again, the footer, we can go to the next slide, but the footer will kind of give you the key takeaways from what we talked about. Here's the GDS channel, and we follow this very closely. It's Bob, it goes to your really the second part of your question, which is the audience piece. The GDS is starting to recover. You can see that with the red line on the bottom of the chart. The blue line is the seasonality. It's very, very interesting about the GDS. If you looked at the February numbers of February 2020, the GDS was going to have actually a record year. It's going to eclipse 78 million hotel bookings. Obviously, we're going to be down greater than 50% for the remainder of the year. You can clearly see that. It is starting to recover week over week, as you can see the red line. The key piece that we're going to be watching, and I'll make sure that I include this in the presentation in September, is the recovery in the government and how that channel is looking, because as we know, a lot of the business segment goes through the GDS. As business travel starts to return, the GDS will follow that. And we've seen this in 2008 and even in 2001, is that when companies do put travelers back on the road, it's going to be through mandated travel with safety protocols. And so we'll start to see that in the GDS as the hotel bookings increase. We are seeing it, again, Bob, to your point, we're seeing it internationally. China's rebound has been significant in countries such as Norway. We've seen a significant, now, China is very different with this because China has a very strong domestic travel audience, and China's turned back on its tour operators. So if we looked at China data, China in some markets is only down 10% from last year, amazingly so. So, I don't want to be optimistic because I think that would be false hope at this time, but we are seeing in other parts of the world that the business market is returning. We're seeing some of that in the GDS, but right now, specifically for Washington, specifically in North America, it's transient leisure for the next 8 to 12 weeks. Okay? So with that said, let's move on because I know that people are eager to see.
I always love the DC numbers. That's what keeps people coming back, John.
Yeah. Okay. So let's focus on DC. And again, I say, John, why so much context? Yeah, I'll tell you why. It's because we weren't first in on this, and we can learn from other parts of the world because this has been a non-discriminating pandemic. So that's why we focused the front of this outside of Washington. And when you start to look at Washington, I think all of you are going to look at it and go like, well, those numbers are pretty familiar now because we are increasing. We see increases. They're steady increases. I thought Bob had some excellent comments about ADR. It's not a price issue. This isn't a price issue with the prospective guest. It just isn't. And what we're seeing are those health and safety standards and how we reassure guests. And so many of the surveys I've seen within the last couple of weeks is the hotel's check-in process touchless? Is it touchless? Do I have to touch anything? Those concerns. What's the protocol for masks? Now that's been somewhat resolved, but all those things are important. And so you can see, and Bob, this echoes your comment, is we let's not make this an ADR problem. Let's figure out how to compete more effectively in the local marketplace. And again, the opportunistic hotelier is thinking about that drive market. When you start to look at drive data versus flight data, and one of the great things about the Washington, DC market, it is very drivable, it's accessible, and it's an opportunity. And again, if you draw a circle, a radius of about 300 miles around your property, and you think about the states, and fortunately, within New York and New Jersey, there's opportunities within that drive audience for transient. And you have a phenomenal city, a world-class city for people to enjoy the final weeks of summer vacation, which is an opportunity as long as you're presenting this in terms of health and safety, because that's the issue. So there's an overview of Washington. Let's move on to the next slide because we can see the recovery. And then you can see, and I'm speaking with Chris Zindash, who really keeps me up to date on Washington, is that it's terrible because you're looking with colleagues that are furloughed. We're looking at budgets that are decimated, and you're saying, should I even bother to market the hotel? The answer unequivocally is yes, with a smaller, more mindful budget. Bob talked about micro learnings. I think when we start to revisit marketing, it's micro budgets, and it's really looking at a smaller percentage, a much smaller percentage of the transient investments you had before. And then the other piece, and we're seeing some really savvy hoteliers use this formula, is not so much focus on return on ad spend, but look at contribution above fixed cost. So, you've made a decision to open up your property. You have a fixed cost. Can I acquire that transient guest and make a contribution above that fixed expense rather than saying, well, if I don't have a 10-to-1, I'm not going to invest in advertising. You have to invest. You have to inform people that the hotel is open. You have to have promotions out there that appeal to transient leisure at this time. But you also can do that very, very cost effectively because of just targeting those micro audiences with smaller budgets. And you can see week over week, we have growth. We're not going back. We're going forward. But if you had to say, John, what does it look like? It's week over week increases of about 1% in transient occupancy that probably will hold for the next 4 to 6 weeks. Again, September is going to be a little bit of a different animal here. We'll address that in September, but right now we are starting to see a return to the marketplace. Why don't we go to the next slide? I know we'll show the footer first. Okay. In terms of net res and class of service, what's very, very interesting when you start to look at res, a couple of pieces here. Again, going back to April, we were seeing many more cancellations than new incremental bookings. So we follow that activity. And you can see we're netting out reservations to try to look at what's truly positive and take cancels out of there. And then when you start to look at these slides, you can really see how much, again, compression there is in the booking window. And again, very, very, very similar. This is specific to Washington, D.C., but if we looked at other markets, we'd say that there's a very similar pattern of when people feel comfortable making reservations. And I wouldn't say that this is a post-COVID world. I'd say this is an emerging COVID world that we're learning to manage in. And again, learning to manage in near real time and making these leisure decisions inside 7 days is something that you've heard me, repeatedly say in this webinar, which again, I think is an emerging best practice. So we can move on. Ellen, thank you. And then look at class of service. I want to speak a little bit about class of service because it's something that, again, is very different in this emerging COVID analysis that we're doing. The economy hotels, the limited service hotels, the drive hotels are actually kind of leading the hotel industry out of the declines that we saw in April. It doesn't mean that the full service, the luxury hotels cannot compete, because they certainly can. But when you look at the people that need to be out, I guess, Bob, this goes to your question about the business sector coming back. A lot of the people that are traveling for business, especially if they have business within that 250 to 300 mile range. And we do think, in terms of, we just didn't pull that out of a hat. That's a data-driven stat of about 300 miles of where it kind of separates becoming a drive audience to a flying audience. But inside 300 miles, the limited service, the economy hotels are definitely capturing that audience. And a lot of it is location and proximity to major interchanges. But again, the value proposition and that piece of trying to get a family in to enjoy a late summer vacation is still an opportunity for the next 4 to 6 weeks. But this really kind of shows, some of that ADR. And again, let's not make this an ADR problem, even though it's very tempting to do so. Why don't we move on? Thanks, Ellen. So again, lead time, and think about how similar this slide is. And again, this is a slide that's very, very specific to what we showed for the United States, or what we show throughout the world. What is incredibly interesting from a data perspective, here we have been down as an industry on our lows almost 90 or 95% in some market. But when you look at that 1 week and the addressable audience there, which is the green vertical line, you actually have more there than you did 1 week last year. That's a mind-bending statistic. Now, it doesn't hold true, and you can just see when the diminishing value when you look at the slide from left to right, and you can see how little is there in outside of 2 weeks. And again, I'm trying to use data to make my points here, is that if you're open, you want to compete in that current week, we'd give you guidance to look at a contribution above fixed expense rather than relying on return on ad spend. But then we'd also really, really encourage you to say, look, I'm not going to panic and think about that audience that's 3-4 weeks down the road, because that's a ways away, and people aren't really shopping or making decisions. That audience is there in a very compressed time, and how I compete in that time is really my opportunity for success. Now, it's going to repeat itself next week, right? Next week, you're going to have another opportunity of, do I capture that transient audience? Because the people that are traveling inside that current week. And again, materially different than anything we've seen before. Thanks,
hey, John, on this compression issue again, the trend doesn't look dramatically different from what you showed in terms of the other statistics when you talk about the industry overall. Was there anything in DC that jumped out at you as being uniquely different?
And I'll look at this closer in September, because I think it's a question that requires further analysis.
Okay.
When we do the state of the industry, one of the key questions that always comes up, and I'll have the data next month for you, Bob, is the segment and the government business. And it's so important this year, because we want to look at, the different outcomes of the government and how that'll impact Washington, D.C. in terms of government business, corporate business, lobbying business that's coming in over the next 60 to 90 days. Now, we've got some rate code information that I'll be sharing in September that I think will give you guidance. And the reason, for number one, for time constraint, I couldn't put it in today. But the second piece of why I think it's important to look at it in September is because that we know it's going to change as we get closer to the November election. We know.
Okay.
So what we'll be able to give you in September is kind of past, present, and future, but very specific to rate segmentation in Washington, D.C. So definitely
Okay.
put that in when we meet next month.
Okay. Hey, John, one other quick question in the chat box here, just a confirmation of the data set. Of the 375 hotels that were mentioned, is that Virginia, Maryland, and DC all combined? Is that what you're defining as the market?
It should be Washington, D.C. Metro. I'll double check that with
Okay.
Chris, okay? But it should
Okay.
be within that defined area of Washington, D.C.
Okay, sounds good.
Yeah. So emerging best practices. Almost said the word emergency at that time, and this is pretty close to an emergency. So let's look at it. But again, building the recovery plan. Number one, and the slide, Ellen, so you can kind of talk to it and advance the slide now. But when we start to look at the travel restrictions, and Bob had asked that question, and it's definitely a moving target, and it's something that you have to almost monitor on a daily basis, which when you're looking and working with your local market representative, the safest bet right now is that audience inside 300 miles. That's a drive audience. And here's why, and I didn't say this earlier, but I'm glad that I remember this, is that when you start to try to acquire guests right now, what we don't want to do is have you start a campaign and then stop it. So what we're looking is, you think about source markets, we're looking for markets that are in a reasonable proximity, and I'll say that are safe bets. They're low on the scale of infections and new cases. So we're mining all of that data, but again, we're starting to really look at that to say, if you are going to market, we want to give you feeder markets that we think can be run on continuous campaigns, because as I said earlier, that repetition is going to continue to repeat itself in 7-day increments going forward. So the feeder markets that we're working and you should be working on are what we're going to call safe feeder markets, because we want to keep you away from those volatile markets that are going to impose travel restrictions and then, really frankly, waste an advertising budget that is too precious right now to be wasted. And so the other piece, again, and I could harp on this all day long, is that the safetiness, the cleanliness standards. People will say, well, John, I've got them, but I would ask, have you told anyone about them? They're so important in terms of peace of mind and safety and proximity to different establishments, and we didn't even talk about the restaurant community and whether or not DoorDash or Grubhub or something can be done to help, right? And then the last piece, and I think we've had good conversation and good questions on this, thank you, Bob and team, is to really look at that booking window compression. We'll measure it by channel when we meet again in September. But there is a new normal there that we want to be very mindful. But for hoteliers that pay attention to it, it's opportunistic, because when we start to look at the data, and again, this is true in Washington, is you actually see week over week gains in some transient opportunity. But where is that transient opportunity going? If it's not going to your hotel, the data suggests it's going someplace else. So kind of moving on, and I want to thank Ellen and the team, Bob, your staff, for this. We've worked closely over the last couple of months, and you've got just a tremendous amount of information on your website, but we've been privileged to work with HSMAI on recovery kits that are available on our website and your website. We're updating these constantly, and we're going to continue to do so for as long as you tell us that this is needed. So with that, I know that I've got a couple other slides in here, Ellen. You can go ahead and advance those for us. And then,
hey, John, while you're doing that, let me just remind the group to go ahead and, if you've got some questions for John or myself, use the question feature on your the right side of your screen. And we've got a few minutes here. We'll take any of your live questions. So go ahead and think about those and start typing those in. Go ahead, John.
So, in terms of the recovery playbook, one of the things that we're really trying to help hoteliers is the safety protocols. Is what is coming into the reservation centers, what's top of mind of travelers, and what questions are they asking before they choose to transact. And a lot of it goes around the peace of mind of the cancellation policy. And again, do I have a choice of housekeeping, and almost tailoring the housekeeping, the maid experience to the guests' concerns. And those are becoming pretty much standard procedures that hoteliers are taking in terms of call volume every day. But again, week over week travel restrictions are creating that concern about cancellation policy. So I just wanted to add that, Bob. Any other questions coming in, Bob?
There's one question about your comments about the marketing spend shifting, the return ROIs to contribution. Any other advice for individuals on how do they go through that paradigm shift with their managers or maybe their asset managers in some cases?
I think that we go talk about budgeting season. I think it's a very difficult conversation to have, but I think it's one of these business imperatives where if you've made a business decision to be open and you have an asset manager that says, look, I'm not going to invest anything unless I get a 10-to-1. Frankly, let's be real candid with each other. When you look at return on ad spend, and there's Bob, you run HSMAI, so you're familiar with this. How do you calculate return on ad spend? Well, it's ADR times length of stay times attributed revenue, right? Now, your ADR is $400 a night, okay, and you have relatively good conversion, okay, you have a great return on ad spend. Now, even if you convert at the same rate, okay, and your ADR is $300 a night, you've already suffered a 33% reduction in your return on ad spend. That's just simple math. Even if the conversion's the same, because the ADR is down, you've lowered that. So if you're having that conversation with an asset manager that doesn't understand that, it's like you're not going to get that spend even if you have the same conversion. And so that conversion, if you're fortunate, week over week, you may have some of that opportunity, but you're not going to get it. And even if you got the same amount, it's not going to be the same because my ADR is less. And hopefully your ADR is down 30%, not down 50%. So that's the math of this. Go ahead, Bob.
No, I think the other thing I add to that, John, is it go back to your revenue optimization 101 fundamentals. If you haven't dusted off in a while, this is the time to go back and pull out your models on what is the incremental cost of selling a room. A lot of times the education of that process, what that real number is for your managers and your asset managers can be really compelling to help people understand why every incremental dollar you sell over the cost of selling a room, incremental room, will flow through to the bottom line. And it goes back to, again, revenue management fundamentals. It always goes back, the revenue management evolved when we tried to optimize rate in high demand times, but the other opposite end of the spectrum is true. Revenue optimization is still important when you're trying to optimize demand even during low demand times. And certainly many hotels are going to find a lot of low demand times. So I think we need to brush off our skills on what's that incremental cost of selling a room. And that really will hit that home with your asset manager. They understand the premise that every incremental dollar you bring in flows through the bottom line relative to what you're currently at. You have no benchmarks right now. It's a zero occupancy game.
I couldn't agree more, and it's a very difficult conversation. I don't want to say that this is easy dialogue, especially with an asset manager, but I really believe, Bob, that you're right, and you have to look at that incremental contribution and educate, and especially the people that are slightly outside of the industry that may not have your revenue management expertise or your marketing expertise, is have that educational conversation when you're talking about budgets for next year, because the numbers will show. We'll be able to provide you with enough evidence to say that that transient opportunity is there. We'll also help you justify the fact that that transient guest maybe not staying at a hotel, but may feel safer, just may feel safer staying at an alternative accommodation. I don't agree with that, but that's what the numbers show. But if we give you the evidence, I think going back to Bob's point is you need to go back and really start to look at on this and say, what's the incremental contribution? And why is that probably a better formula right now than looking at it as I did before on just return on ad spend? So Bob, I don't know if you have any final comments on that. I know we're getting close to the time or questions, so I'll turn it back to you.
There's no other questions at this point in time from the audience. But I think the one of the piece of advice I'd give some of our listeners is they're bound to all have ownership structures that are very diverse. But I would say if there's ever a time you need empathy for your owners, it's now, because at the end of the day, the tough decisions they've had to make are all liquidity-based decisions. It's not been about what they want to do in terms of changing staff models or where they're reinvesting. It's been about liquidity. So make sure that as a sales, marketing, or revenue person, you understand what are your owner's objectives. They have very likely changed or shifted in the last few months during this pandemic. Make sure you're briefed on that, so you're in a position to really talk to them intelligently about what your path forward is going to be. So, John, any other quick headlines on other things that we're going to see beyond updates on this at the State of the Industry program next month?
Again, we're appreciate the opportunity, and we're definitely going to look at the segmentation, returning business audience, making sure that as the election draws near, what are the opportunities that are specific to Washington D.C. We'll have just so you know, we'll have a full 365 days of data available to us. And Bob, we'll work with you, Ellen, and the team. And we'll, I think that the question in my mind, Bob, and you and I definitely can talk about this, is how far in advance should we give guidance? Normally for that audience, we give guidance a full 365. We can definitely show that, but I'm very interested in looking in September of what the next 30 or 60 days will look like pre and post election. But again, thank you so much for the opportunity. If you do have questions, if you do have suggestions of what we can cover in September, please send in your thoughts to us, because sometimes they're they're simple requests and we can run the data sets for you. So I'd be happy to do that as kind of, again, a value add for those of you that are going to join us in September. But Bob, again, thank you. Always a pleasure to be with you.
Well, John, and thank you. And just a reminder to everybody, we will be sending out this deck to everybody who is registered for the webinar. So with that, Sheila, we'll turn it back over to you for any wrap up you want to do.
Thank you so very much. So really, truly, thank you for taking the time today to share the critical data and your views on what's next for this chapter. And John, I loved your quote of data offers hope. Seeing the small uptick in travel offers a bit of relief to all of us, especially on the transient leisure side. And thank you for your suggestions on how to best lure these travelers and address the emerging best practices. And for all that joined us, we hope you gained some helpful takeaways. Remember, you will receive a link to today's recording. Please then mark your calendars for the 2 events in September. So Wednesday, September 16th, we have Partnering with Attractions to Drive Business. And then on Thursday, September 24th, it's our annual and most anticipated State of the Industry. And as John said, please do forward any topics that you would like to see addressed. Both events will be virtual. Additional details are forthcoming, but you can also find information at hsmaidc.org. And lastly, on behalf of Ellen Wilson, Managing Director, and our entire advisory board, we wish you a wonderful rest of your day. And this now ends our webinar.